Identification, interview with Professor Ikime. Prof, thank you for allowing us to come to your home, but my voice is not coming out. So, the first question I'm going to ask Prof is that, what is jihad and how did it affect Africa?
Well, jihad, as commonly understood, is what the Muslims describe as a holy war. And really, it is a war of conquest of non-Muslims by Muslim peoples. It's theoretically, a jihad takes place when Muslims seek conversion of non-Muslim people, and they are allowed by their religion to use force to bring about that conversion. They call it a holy war, the contradiction between holy and war notwithstanding. And for some areas, because you're asking about how did it affect Africa, for some areas the word jihad was hardly used. Because when you go back to the 7th century and to look at the Arab conquest of North Africa, the word jihad hardly featured in those conquests, from Egypt across the Maghreb down to Libya. Over the centuries, as the Arabs fought forth from Arabia across onto Africa, they didn't use the word jihad. In history, we describe it as the Arab conquest of North Africa. And what they were doing was establishing both the religion and governance over the area, so that you have a situation in which Egypt, for example, was a Christian country, was conquered by Arabia, and Islam planted to the point that today Egypt is regarded as an Arab country. All right, but of course we know it was one of the earliest centers of Christianity in Africa. You remember when our Lord was born and his life was threatened, he was asked, his parents were asked to take him to Egypt. Right. At that point, Egypt was a Christian, was seen as a non-Arab, a non-Muslim, non-Arab country. The Coptic religion came up there, and Egypt became a Christian place until the Arab conquest, the 7th century, overturned that, and so Islam was born there. Now from Egypt, they moved across what they call the Maghreb, North Africa. And again, in areas like Tunisia, you had Christian centers there prior to the coming of the Arabs. So they came in and okay. So I said that move across North Africa completely altered the religious configuration of North Africa. Now, from there, of course, they began to push southwards into what you might call northeastern Africa, on to to Libya, the Sudan, and even Ethiopia. Right. So all of that conquest was not, in fact, officially regarded as jihad, although it was a jihad by their definition. And the word jihad became more popular in the later centuries of Arabic expansion into Africa. Basically, it was their way of spreading the Muslim faith. And this has continued into the modern times. And in modern times, at least in Nigeria, the word jihad has become popular to describe this conversion by force by the Muslims in areas that are not Muslim as of the time of conquest.
Now, Prof, the one-time premier, the first premier of northern Nigeria, who is a grandson of Usman Dan Fodio, was quoted by Nigerian press in those days that he said it was the British that stopped his grandfather from dipping the Quran into the sea. So, what was the historical perspective of that jihad in Nigeria? Then, is it really true that Uthman Danfodio could have put the Quran inside the sea? That means conquered the south or the southern part of Nigeria, if he had the power?
Well, as you know, what we have come to call northern Nigeria was a collection of independent states, Hausa states, actually, up in the far north. In the middle, you had a large number of groups of people who were not centrally organized. And for centuries, the Hausa states had existed as such. So Kano, Katsina, Zazawan, they were all there, separate, independent kingdoms. In fact, they fought various wars among themselves as each sought to expand territory and so on. Now, these wars were fought between sovereign states, as it were, from the 12th century on to the 18th. Now, no Hausa state, as it turned out, had the technical and other capacity to lord it over the others. So for some time, Kano seemed to expand. Then it would be Zaria that would expand. There are more wars before there would be some contraction, and so on. So this was like a seesaw thing going on over centuries. Each of them seeking to promote the identified interests of the particular state, commercial or otherwise. Now that went on, as I said, for centuries. In the meantime, Islam began to filter into Nigeria, first through Borno. And the Islam came through the trade routes from North Africa, what we call the Trans-Saharan trade routes, coming down from North Africa into what became northern Nigeria. And as traders came in from North Africa, they brought with them some of their religion. And gradually, you began to have pockets of Muslims in the different states. And in terms of what you might call a state religion, in fact, Borno was the first center of Islam in what became Nigeria. But pockets of Muslims began to be found in the other Hausa states. Sokoto did not exist as such in the earlier years, but Islam began to, as I said, develop in different positions. Then came a flowering of the religion through scholarship in the states, and some of those who became Nigerians, if you like, began to be schooled in Muslim ways, in Islamic studies. And that's how Uthman Danfodio emerged as a Muslim scholar and cleric, who began to propagate the view that this faith must be spread across to the peoples of the area. And the beginning of the jihad came from this flowering of Islamic studies or scholarship, led in our own case by Uthman Danfodio. And so that's how Sokoto was born. Now from there, they began to penetrate the other Hausa states by war, through war and conquest. And the jihad of the 19th century did succeed in planting what you might call emirates.
What you do, just pull up. Action.
Okay. As I said, Uthman Danfodio arose as the leader of these clerics, these persons who had become schooled in Muslim theology and so on, and began to propagate the idea that rulership should be in the hands of those who were so schooled in Islamic scholarship. Now, he established what you might call a school of Islamic theology and led it and wrote various books about Islam and Islamic governance. Now, from that beginning came the idea of moving out to the other states, the other Hausa states, and getting them to accept the Islamic ways and establishing, if you like, theocracies in that region. With Manafodio himself was essentially a teacher and scholar, far more than he was a warrior or commander. The actual fighting was done by persons of lower caliber in terms of even the understanding of Islam. And there wasn't a central army that departed from Gobiri or Sokoto and went out taking one after the other. They tried to raise local armies, but leadership will come from Sokoto, and they will then establish one area and they move on. Another set of people will be raised at the Montana state and so on until they established centers or became emirates across northern Nigeria. Of course, Borno opposed the jihad coming to Borno on the ground that they were already, in fact, Muslim. But by that time, the political aspect of the jihad had been established. And so Borno and Sokoto actually had to fight wars over that issue. At the end, the Shehu of Borno always came out different from every other emir. That's why you find that in the political terms, in the early 50s, when you had your premier from Sokoto, the governor from Borno. Now that was an attempt at keeping the equation of what had happened at the time of the actual struggle. Because the Borno people argued rightly that you cannot fight a jihad against a Muslim state. All right. And although for political reasons wars were fought, it was clear that Borno was treated